Chapter 1 Vacation Hoax. It's beautiful. What is? It's spooky. What's spooky? It's fun, but it's dangerous. Nancy Drew smiled at her two friends, Beth and George, who were listening intently. George Vane spoke up. She was a tall, slender, athletic girl who loved her boyish name. You forgot to say it's intriguing. But what is, and where is it? The spot we're going to, Nancy replied. That is, you girls are invited to join me. I hope you can come. Nancy went on to say that Aunt Eloise Drew, her father's sister, who lived in New York City, had rented a cottage on a bay. The name of the cabin is Mirror Bay Bide-A-Wee. Bess Marvin, blonde, pretty, and always talking about going on a diet, looked at Nancy puzzled. The place sounds wonderful. What did you mean by all those things you were saying about it? Nancy, slim and attractive-looking, with reddish-blonde hair, said, There's a mystery, of course. Aunt Eloise heard that early on misty mornings a woman is seen gliding over the water. In what? George queried. Oh, she's walking, Nancy replied. How could she? George asked skeptically. That's one thing I want to find out, Nancy answered. The lake, of which the bay is a part, is 167 feet deep in the middle. Wow, Bess exclaimed. Dangerous spot to fall overboard with heavy shoes on. Nancy said the water was shallow near the shore and gradually became deeper. Bess and George, who were cousins, asked where the lake was. In New York State, Nancy told them. The Indians called the lake Otesaga, and there's a lovely hotel named after it. Later, James Fenimore Cooper wrote stories about settlers and Indians in the area. He found the water so much like a mirror that he called it Glimmerglass. Now the official name is Otsego Lake. Nancy explained that at the southern end of the lake was the famous village of Cooperstown. George's eyes lighted up. That's where the Baseball Hall of Fame is. Right, Nancy replied. And there also are many interesting museums in and around Cooperstown. Sounds great to me, Bess remarked. When would we go? Tomorrow morning, Nancy replied. Aunt Eloise is taking a bus to Cooperstown from New York. We're to meet her there and drive along the water to Hyde Bay, then walk down to Bide-A-Wee cabin. Bide-A-Wee, said Bess. That's Scottish for stay a while, isn't it? Yes, Nancy agreed. Well, how about you girls getting on the phone and finding out if you can go with me? It took less than 10 minutes for the cousins to call their parents and get permission. They hurried home to pack, and Nancy went out to the kitchen to talk to the Drews' housekeeper, Hannah Gruen. Mrs. Gruen had been with the family since the death of Mrs. Drew when Nancy was only 3 years old. The tender-hearted woman was like a mother to her and was very proud of Nancy's accomplishments as a young amateur detective. Nevertheless, she was always a little fearful when Nancy set off on one of her sleuthing expeditions. Do you know what I heard? She asked. That there are bears in the woods of Cooperstown area. You'd better be mighty careful if you go up in the mountains. Nancy laughed. Suppose I carry a few combs of honey with me, she teased. If a bear comes my way, I'll toss one at him. Hannah Gruen smiled. You always know what to do, she said. Nancy's father was out of town, but the next morning she said goodbye to him on the telephone. Tall, handsome Carson Drew was a well-known attorney in River Heights. She picked up Bess and George in her convertible, and they set off for Cooperstown. The long drive in the fresh summer air was delightful. They stopped for lunch on a wayside snack bar. Soon after starting off again, they were confronted with a long detour. Oh dear, said Nancy. We'll have to go miles out of our way and be late meeting Aunt Eloise. I just hate to think of her waiting on the sidewalk with her luggage. Maybe she'll go to the lovely hotel you mentioned, Bess suggested. Nancy shook her head. Not if I know Aunt Eloise. She'll be right at the bus stop. Nancy put on all the speed the law allowed and finally pulled into the main street of Cooperstown 20 minutes late. "My goodness, what's going on?" Bess asked. Along one curb stood 5 large buses. People were milling about the street, arguing and making threats to no one in particular. There were suitcases and tote bags strewn on the sidewalk. Shopkeepers had come outside to learn what the trouble was. Nancy parked some distance from the commotion, locked the car, and the 3 girls hurried up the street. They saw Aunt Eloise standing in the doorway of a shop, guarding her own luggage. "Nancy!" exclaimed the tall, charming woman, who taught school in New York. The 3 girls kissed her, then asked what was going on. "Right after my regularly scheduled bus arrived here," she said, "this group of charter buses drove in. These people were aboard. As I understand the story, they had been sold tickets in New York City for a week's stay at a very elegant place called the Homestead on the mountain. The round trip and all hotel expenses were only $100 per person. But now it seems the hotel reservation was a hoax. There was no such place here as the Homestead on the mountain." "How dreadful," said Bess. "Who's responsible for this?" Miss Drew said that she did not know. The bus drivers claimed to be entirely innocent. Their company had been paid for making the charter trip from New York City. The agitated passengers looked closely at their brochures of the trip, and now they discovered that the tickets did not include a return trip, even though they had been promised one. "It's an outrage," screamed a red-faced woman. Just then, one of the irate men spotted Nancy. In a couple of leaps, he was at her side and grabbing her shoulders. "Here she is," he shouted, "the faker." Nancy removed the man's hand and stared at him. "What are you talking about?" she asked. By this time, a crowd of people was running toward the girl. Someone exclaimed, "She's the one all right." Aunt Eloise stepped forward. "I demand to know what you're accusing my niece of." For answer, the man pulled a brochure from his pocket. He pointed to a reproduction of a photograph. The pamphlet was printed on the kind of paper used for newspapers, and the picture was not distinct. It showed a round-faced man and a girl who certainly did resemble Nancy. "There's your proof," the irate passenger said to Aunt Eloise. "Get the police, somebody." There was no need to summon them. 2 state police officers were already on hand and pushing their way through the crowd. "What's going on here?" one of them demanded. The man from New York answered, "This girl sold me a phony ticket and I want my money back." Aunt Eloise, Bess, and George exclaimed in unison, "She did not! There was some mistake!" One of the officers faced Nancy. "What do you have to say?" Quickly, Nancy explained that evidently some girl who resembled her and the man partner had cheated all these people out of a vacation. She ended by saying, "I had nothing to do with it. My friends and I just arrived in a car. This is my aunt. She has rented a cottage on the bay and we're about to go there." The adamant passenger pushed the brochure and his hotel reservation toward the policeman. "Don't pay any attention to what they say. Here's proof." The 2 officers stared at the photograph. Then one said he thought that while the girl did resemble Nancy, she was no doubt someone else. He asked to see Nancy's driver's license. Bess, George, and Aunt Eloise also showed theirs. The angry man moved away. He seemed unconvinced and cried out, "What's to become of us? We paid all this money and we have no place to stay and no ride back to New York." The officer said he would see what he could do to help the stranded travelers. He smiled at Aunt Eloise. "I'm sorry you people had such an unfortunate welcome to Cooperstown. I hope your stay here will be so enjoyable you will forget what happened." Miss Drew thanked him and turned away from the crowd. The girls picked up her luggage and headed for the car. Aunt Eloise pointed across the street. A man was just entering a restaurant. "That's my bus driver," she said. Handsome," Bess murmured. The others smiled. Miss Drew directed her niece to East Lake Road, which ran a few hundred feet above the lake. On their left was the mirror-like water. Here and there a sailboat went by, wafted by a lazy breeze. Along the shore were several camps where children were swimming. Sounds of laughter came up the hillside. To the right of the road was a steep wooded hillside, broken only now and then by a house or a garage. Some 6 miles from town they came to a small parking area on their left and climbed out of the car. They gathered their bags and trudged down the path leading to the waterfront. Soon an attractive cabin came into view. Though on the bay, it was near the point where the inlet joined the lake proper. "Welcome to Mirror Bay Bide-A-Wee," said Aunt Eloise. "I hope you girls will have a glorious time and solve the mystery of the woman who can glide over the water." The cabin was rustic and had a large front porch with a view west across the lake and north across the bay. Besides a living room with a huge fireplace and a well-furnished kitchen, there were 3 good-sized bedrooms. Miss Drew assigned Nancy to one, the cousins to another, and the third to herself. As soon as the hot, weary travelers had unpacked, they put on bathing suits and went for a swim. "What gorgeous water!" George exclaimed, doing a quick overhand toward the middle of the sparkling lake. "Come back!" cried Bess. "There's enough water around here to swim in." George turned back. "Bet I could swim all the way to the west bank of the lake without stopping," she said. "Oh, how I hate myself," she grinned. Refreshed and hungry, the girls insisted that Aunt Eloise sit on the porch and enjoy the brilliant sunset while they prepared supper. "I wonder what happened to all those poor bus passengers," said Bess. "And I wonder," Nancy added, "where that girl is who resembles me. I hope she doesn't show up around this area." "Oh, she wouldn't dare," George insisted. "Don't be too sure," Bess warned. The group went to bed early and slept soundly. Nancy awoke early, raised up from her bed, and looked out the window toward the water. It was very misty. "Maybe that woman who glides over the water is out there now," she thought. "Anyway, it won't hurt to look. It's possible the story was made up just to amuse tourists." Quietly, Nancy arose, put on her slippers, and walked to the porch. Suddenly, she gave a start. Was her imagination playing tricks, or did she really see a ghostly figure gliding over the water?